Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna Wittenberg and K.S. Barton each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 26, in which Johanna and I are going to discuss something a little different. Rather than a historical topic, we want to talk about our research and our writing process. There is a lot of research that goes into writing historical fiction and fantasy, so we'll dive into how we take what we've learned in our research and use that in our books. I'm K.S. Barton, the author of the Norse Family Trilogy, a story in which a Viking warrior and a young Viking woman are caught in a deadly blood feud between two brothers. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hello, how are you?
I'm great.
Good. Well, I'm Johanna Wittenberg, and I'm the author of the Norse Women series. It's the story of a real Norse queen who lived and ruled alone in the early 9th century in Norway. And my latest book, which is book number 7 in the series, The Irish Harper, is going to be released next week. So I'm very excited about that. I'm glad all the edits are over.
Give us the date.
It looks like it's going to be the 18th.
Of March.
Yep, 18th of March. Yep.
Okay. So it should be out by the time this podcast is released. That'll be exciting. Yeah, and I love the cover. I love all your covers.
But, thank you.
This
yeah,
one is
I
great
love them too.
Mm-hmm.
I have a great cover designer who's very willing to work with me on everything.
Yeah, that's one thing when we talk about being like indie authors or self-published or however you want to say it. It's like most of us, we don't do it ourselves, everything. There's lots of things that we outsource, like editing and cover designs, and some of us outsource the formatting and just all kinds of things. So
it's really impossible to do it yourself. I mean, I have lots of beta readers.
Me too.
Final critique people who look over it one last time in print. I couldn't do it without all of them.
We have a team. It's like having a team behind you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you researched Åsa and how you came to finding out about her and all that?
Well, I originally was introduced to her way back when I was in college, which was a long, long time ago. And I was helping my mother research Vikings for her art. And her art appears on my covers.
I love that.
Yeah, and so that's what inspired me, because we found Åsa together. This was, back in the late 70s, early 80s, and we were so astounded to find out that there was actually a woman who ruled alone in the early Viking Age. It kind of flew in the face of everything that was common knowledge, especially at that time. But
especially back then.
Yeah, especially. And so I've always loved her. And so is my mom. And when I finally decided to start writing, I wanted to write historical because that's my favorite genre. And I thought, well, why not her? So then I went back to the sources, and really the only real main source for Åsa is the Heimskringla, which is Snorri Sturluson's Lives of the Norse Kings.
And that is a dense book.
It's a really dense book.
I don't think I've read it cover to cover. I've gone through stories and pieces and looked in the index to find certain people and certain things. And
yeah, me too, because it's so much, but you can find a lot in there.
Yeah.
But one of the things, I've discovered, and also a lot of the research I've done of other writers who are talking about women in the Norse world, is that with Snorri, you have to read between the lines. And also the fact that he was writing, 400 years after Åsa lived, in a Christian society, a male-dominated society, very, very different than the Viking Age. So he was romanticizing it. You think about, King Arthur and how that's been romanticized. Well, this was the same kind of thing where Snorri put it into the context of the society he lived in. And so I will read you the tiny little snippets about Queen Osa, but it was enough to inspire me to this entire series, which is now 7 books long.
Nice.
Um,
And which story is she in? Which
she's in the
saga?
Ynglinga saga,
Okay.
the first mention of her. She's actually in two different sagas. The first one is the Ynglinga saga. And she's towards the end of it, almost the last page. We're talking about Gudrid the Magnificent, who was the king of Vestfold in we think, the early ninth century. His wife died, and he sent his men to the west to Agder, which is the southern part of Norway, south of Vestfold, to the king who was ruling there, who's called Harold Redbeard. And they were to ask the king for his daughter, Osa, but Harold refused it. The men thus came back and brought the king the answer. Sometime after this, King Gudrid launched his ships and went out with a great army to Agder. He came there very suddenly, made a landing in the night, and came about King Harold's houses. When Harold was aware that an army came against him, he went out with such men as he had. There was a battle and a great clash of men. There fell King Harold and his son Gerd, and King Gudrid took great booty. He took home with him King Harold's daughter, Osa, and held a bridal feast with her. They had one son who was called Halfdan. But in the harvest, when Halfdan was a year old, King Gudrid fared on a round of feasts. He lay with his ship in Stivlesund, and there much drinking, and the king became very drunk. In the evening, when it was dark, the king went from his ship, and when he came to the end of the gangway, a man leaped out and stuck a spear into him, and that was his bane. The man was straightway slain, and the next morning, when it was light, he was recognized as Queen Osa's shoe lad. She did not deny that it was done by her counsel. And then there's a poem about how bad Osa was for, and it says, when a death plan of revenge against the drunken prince found outlet, and to win money, that sneaky carl of Osa won against the king, and the prince was stabbed on the shore of Stivlesund. So that's actually from the 10th century, that poem is. So, it's semi-contemporary. So then the second part of this is in the story of Halfdan the Black, which is Osa's son, Osa and Gudrid's son. When Halfdan was 1 winter old, his father was slain. His mother Osa straightway went west with him to Agder, and there she set herself in the kingdom which her father had had. And there Halfdan grew up and became very big and strong and black-haired. And he was called Halfdan the Black. When he was 19 winters old, he took the kingdom of Agder and went straight to Vestfold and shared the kingdom with his brother Olaf, which is actually his half-brother, Olaf.
Mm.
It was the adult son of Gudrid and his former wife, Alfhild was her name.
I love that when her father was attacked, he and his men went out with what menace they had.
Oh,
The
I'm
word.
sorry. No, it was what men they had.
Oh, what men they
Probably
had. Oh, but I still
my
love
bad
menace.
pronunciation. So it was a surprise attack.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and
So
saying
when I noticed when you were reading that, and it's something that happens all the time in the sagas, is it sounds like she was a prisoner, that she was taken and forced against her will to marry this man.
yep.
But it's just glossed over. And that was one thing, it was one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to start writing about women, even if they weren't queens or anything. It was like, wait a minute. I remember reading a saga and I can't remember the name of it. No, it wasn't a saga. It was in an old book, maybe like The Long Ships. Did you
Oh,
read that,
mhm.
friends? Yeah. And there was like a woman who'd been kidnapped and she was like kept with this man and these people and she escaped or that somehow they saved her. And then it was just mentioned like, oh, and she was very quiet. And I'm like, yeah, the poor
No
woman had
kidding.
been kidnapped and, raped and who knows what else. And when she finally gets back home, she's traumatized and it's just like, and she was quiet. Like, I'm like,
Are you
No kidding.
kidding?
Are you kidding me? So yeah, and to just gloss over that, like, oh, and then she, was married to him. It's like against her will.
Mhm. And there are, several incidences in the sagas where women are kidnapped and
Sure.
forced to marry. And it's for property rights. It's for the reason that Gudrid wanted to marry Osa was for her kingdom.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I had to do an awful lot of research into this because I didn't want the way the saga makes Osa sound. Is that she was a very ruthless woman to have her shoe boy attack Gudrid.
Who
Uh,
has a shoe boy?
I don't know, and I really kind of don't know that they had shoe boys in the Viking Age, to be honest with you.
Maybe it's is it a translation thing?
I have no idea because I haven't read it in the original, but
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
you know,
interesting. Like, is it like,
and how it so then the poem says the sneaky Carl for silver. So what does that mean? That she paid him? So if she persuaded him in any way to commit this murder for her or assassination for her, how would what in what world would he think he wouldn't immediately be killed?
right?
I mean, how did he think so he was somehow willing to sacrifice his life for her and she was all right with that? I
Mm.
I don't think that that sort of person would make a good heroine. So
True.
I had to think around it because first of all, I just didn't believe it. I didn't
Hmm.
believe any of it. I mean, I believed the attack and the, kidnapping and the forced marriage, and I could believe that she had a child and that she waited until the child was born. That makes sense. And also,
Hmm.
the Vikings are very well known for waiting to take, there's the saying that a slave takes vengeance immediately, and vengeance is best served up cold. That's very much part of the Vikings' philosophy. And she was a practical woman. She waited until her child was born. She waited until he was a year old so that she could take him with her.
Hmm.
And she planned this all out then. But in my story, I had her be the aggressor, her be the person who committed the assassination, and she did it to save her son. In
Hmm.
that, I also gleaned some things from some other sagas there, where I had Gudrid ready to sacrifice his son
Hmm.
in order to gain favor with the gods, but also he wasn't really Gudrid's son. Halfdan was actually Olaf's son. So I put a whole bunch of twists in this story that certainly could have been possible,
Hmm.
but they fit a lot better with my idea of a heroic Viking Age woman. Uh,
So that's a good place to, remind listeners about that these women who were doing things that were normal in the Viking Age and certainly normal for men to do, but that somehow that gets all twisted up by the time these stories are written down. So,
mhm.
I mean, we talked about Gunhild and how she was just maligned for being a witch and being so horrible. And
And yet she was really probably just trying to protect her own people.
right, yeah,
And that's what I made the main theme in my first book is that, as a mother,
hmm,
Osa's job was to protect her son,
right.
and that's what she did.
Wasn't there another? Was it Olaf, King Olaf, who was originally like his mom had to flee into Sweden?
Yes, yes. And their ship was attacked and she was captured and never heard of again. And he was a slave for a while, and then someone recognized him somehow. Don't ask me
Mm.
how. And he ended up at the court in Russia, and
Mm.
then they supported him to come back to Norway and take what was his. There's also another story about a king's daughter or princess. They didn't really call them princesses, but who was kidnapped in a similar way. And she and her servants found a way to kill her kidnapper while he was fleeing with her. And they were
Mm.
camped out one night, and she persuaded, or they helped her. assassinate him. And I looked at that as a possibility for a while, but it was extremely far-fetched.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another one in the Half Down the Black story where I'm trying to remember exactly where it is, where the man is the a kidnapper has stolen the bride, and Half Down the Black comes after him, I believe, and the man commits suicide. The
Wow.
kidnapper commits suicide.
Don't see that very often.
No, no. Anyway, there were quite a
Mm-hmm.
few different tales in which women were women of Jarl's daughters,
Status. Mm-hmm.
because they have the right of inheritance. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something else to mention, is that women did have the right of inheritance during the Viking Age. And there was no primogeniture. It wasn't that the oldest son or the oldest child inherited everything. It was divided among the
Mm-hmm.
children.
It was usually like whoever was the strongest
Yeah.
would get it.
Well, they had to kill off, that's what Eric Bloodaxe did later,
Right.
is he killed off all his brothers so he didn't have to
Right.
share Norway with them.
Right. In the book I'm working on now, one of my point of view, I have three point of view characters, and one of them, she had been married at a young age to like a king. I didn't specify where it was, but it was down in like Russia, Ukraine area. And when her husband dies, it's one of his like counselors. It leaves a power vacuum, and
Mm.
she's, even though she's a widow and she does have some rights and power, physically she's in danger. And so one of his counselors helps her and like one of her women to get out before somebody takes her. I mean, the risk was that somebody was going to swoop in and just take her against her will and marry her. So this counselor, who was a friend, helped her escape to go live with a relative. So,
Yeah, and that's in quite a few different stories.
hmm.
And I think I just found the section I was talking about earlier. It was in the saga of Half Down the Black, and it was talking about how Haki the Berserk rode to Sigurd's, he killed Sigurd Ring, and he took Sigurd's daughter Ragnhild
Hmm.
and her brother Guttorm, and he carried them away with them with many goods and treasures, and bore them home to Hadeland, where he had great estates, and they made a feast ready and wished to hold a bridal feast with Ragnhild. But his wounds healed slowly, so he couldn't marry her. And that's when Halfdan the Black came and attacked him. Harik went out with 100 men, and he arranged the journey so well they crossed the water early in the morning to Haki's dwelling, and they watched at the doors of the room where the folks slept. After they went to the dwelling in which Haki lay, they broke in, they took away Rangild and her brother Guttorm, the kidnapped people, and all the goods that were there, and they burned the house and all who were in it. And then they fitted an awning over a splendid wagon and set Rangild and Guttorm in it. And after that, they went to the ice. So they crossed the ice in this wagon. Haki got up and for a short time went after them. But when he came to the ice, he turned down the hilt of his sword and laid himself on the point, so that the point went through him. And there he got his death. so, so that,
Interesting.
yeah, those are some very interesting stories, but it's a theme that crops up very often, very
Hmm.
frequently in the
But
saga.
wasn't it in Sigurd the Dragon Slayer too? I thought his mother was a spoil of war.
Yes,
His father was killed. Hmm.
and in Beowulf, Wiltau, the
Oh, right.
queen,
Hmm.
her name means foreign slave.
That's
So
right.
is one
Hmm.
interpretation of it. So that could mean spoils of war.
Hmm. Yeah. Even Eleanor of Aquitaine had that happen. And this was like, what, the 12th century, I think?
Mhm.
She was like riding from one place to another, and she was beset by some lord who wanted to take her as, yeah, it's crazy
It is.
to
But
think
it's the
about.
property. These are
Yeah.
heirs. They're
Yeah, they're heiresses. Yeah, yeah. But they're so often just glanced over, like, oh,
I
he took
know.
her. And it's like,
And that was
well,
that. Well, how did she react?
right. How does she feel about that? Well, I was also inspired by a saga. Mine was one of the Icelandic sagas that inspired my first book. So when I first read the Icelandic sagas and I read the Laxdæla saga, the saga of the people of Laxardal, I was just like, oh, I love this story so much because part of me liked it because they were more regular people. And
Hmm.
there was something that I don't know, struck me about that. But there was all this like these families feuding and just like people going off to Norway and doing this and people going here and then coming back and lots of like people falling in love and then getting separated. And I was just like, oh, I love this story so much.
There's a lot there.
Yeah. In the introduction to the book I have, they say it's a heroic tragedy in which conflicting loyalties subvert the bonds of family and lead to enmity and vengeance, a dramatic account of social ambition that also probes the rights of women, the lowly born, and the illegitimate, the history of a regional feud over land, wealth, and status. And I'm just like, I'm liking that. So, and there's some people who even believe it was written by a woman.
Yeah,
So.
and it is possible.
Yeah. So after I read that, I was just like, even though, as a reader, I love to read about these powerful people like kings and queens and royalty and all that. But for some reason, when it comes to me actually writing, I prefer people who are just more like everyday people. Even though the main female character in my Norse family saga is the daughter of a jarl, they were petty rulers. They were basically
Right.
chieftains. He's not like Harold Bluetooth or somebody like that. He doesn't have that much power. And so, yeah, in the book I'm writing now, my both of my characters are their families are farmers. My female character's father is a carpenter, and so
And that's
I
what
guess
most people were during the Viking
right.
Age. Even the ones who went a Viking, they were
Right.
they came home and they farmed, or
Right. Yeah, my
they.
main male character is like that too. He's a farmer, but his backstory was that his father had gone off, like, with the local jarl, and he did not. Something happened. I think I had him get a head injury, and he didn't perform well, and he was kind of humiliated by that. So he like forces his son to go and like train to be a good warrior, and so then he does. Whenever the jarl calls him up, he goes and he fights for the summer or whatever, and then he comes home. But he really just wants to be like a farmer and stay with his family. So anyway, but like for some reason, even though I love to read about the kings and queens, for some reason I'm just compelled to write about more regular people.
Oh, I'm glad you do, because knowing about them is, it's much harder to research that because there's not nearly as much information about them. But it's really fascinating to read about their everyday world. And, we don't have, even archaeologically, we don't have an awful lot about the everyday people because most of the burials are for, the
Right.
elite, at least jarls and sorceresses and queens and kings. Those are the burial mounds that we're finding. And most of the everyday people were cremated, and they didn't have grave goods. They didn't have a lot of grave goods. So it was very hard to find out anything about them. We do know a little bit about them from the sagas, but and from archaeology, but not as much. We know that they did weaving. We know from the Oseberg burial ship, some of their everyday household gear. There was cooking equipment, there was weaving equipment, and we know from that even the elite did these everyday things like baking
Hmm.
bread. And, I mean, they didn't have all of it done for them necessarily. They took part in all of these everyday tasks. So it was a much more, I guess you could say, rough and ready lifestyle in the early Viking age than what people think of, as kings
Yeah,
and queens.
that's
Um,
true. Like I have one scene where I was like, okay, so it's in the evening and like the younger children are asleep. And I'm like, okay, so what would my character and her brother be doing? Like, what would they be doing? So I had her adding or like hemming an old dress of hers so it would fit like her younger sister, or doing something with taking some clothes and like refitting them so it would fit a younger sibling. Her brother, who does a lot of hunting for the family, he was taking or and goes out and traps and stuff. I think he might have been oiling and caring for his traps. Just normal, like, okay. I'm like, well, what would they do? I think he also makes his own arrows. So one scene I have him fletching. He's very meticulous, so he's fletching his arrows and taking care of his stuff. And I mean,
And you know they did that, you know.
yeah, like I'm not like spending a ton of time with those kind of boring, mundane parts of life,
But
but I
they
like to
really add
show them.
reality. They add
Mhm,
reality to it.
mhm. There was another scene where they were sitting outside. It was warm, and so they had like a bench outside of their house, and they were sitting outside, and he was doing something, and she was spinning. She had her distaff and her spindle, and she was doing that.
And you know they did all the time.
Yeah, yeah. And they have chickens and goats, and it's summer, so some of their live they have a little bit of livestock, and it was out in a pasture somewhere with the neighbor's shepherd and like so, like a communal something. So yeah, just trying to show some tiny little glimpses into what life might have been like.
I think that really helps to transport the readers into another time and place because I use a lot of weaving and they're cooking. When I found out about Gamla Lost, I love that. It means old cheese. And it was a way of preserving cheese. And I mean, it sounds like I mean, I guess that you could still get it at like one place in Norway, but
Mm.
it's like Limburger on steroids.
Ugh.
So I'm having there's what I have also loved to do dairying, which
Mm,
was a very common occupation.
mhm.
And on the Oseberg burial ship, they did find dairying equipment as well as bread baking equipment. But it's something that it was kind of a hobby of hers, and so she spends a lot of time making cheese.
Mm.
And I researched how exactly they made it. Same way with the brewing, which was a very important part of women. Women did it, and it was considered magical. So those are like everyday things that was part of living, but it
Mhm.
was everything in their daily life was kind of imbued with magical belief.
I had my Jarl's daughter. She didn't ever make cheese. So when she gets married, she has someone teach her how to make cheese.
Mm.
And at first it doesn't work well, but yeah. So yeah.
I actually found an old film on like a black and white film in Norwegian that I
Mm,
couldn't understand that, what they were saying, but it was just interesting to watch about brewing and how they would take the barley and they would put it in a big sack, a gunny sack, and in a river or a stream that was flowing, and they'd rinse it that way and they'd leave it in there for a certain amount of time and
mm.
then they'd bring it in and dry it out and get it to sprout. It was just fascinating, and watching this old black and white movie on YouTube was really cool, even though I couldn't understand what they were saying. It was just he went out with his sleigh to put this in the winter, to put this sack
Oh,
in this
neat.
swiftly flowing stream. It was just cool. Yeah. And so, I really think for me as a reader, that's what I treasure about reading historical fiction because I feel like I can actually go there.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember one time I was looking up like games they might play during the winter
Mm.
inside. And I'm just now thinking, I can't remember the name of the game, but it's like there's a trunk that's set up in like the middle, and there's like two people who would play it. And they each have to keep their hand on the trunk, and then
Ah,
they're blindfolded, and then they each have a sack with something kind of heavy in it. And they have to like, it's almost like Marco Polo, like you would play in a swimming pool, like when the
mhm.
person and they're both blindfolded, and then one person has to like say the other's name. And I know they might say, "Oh, can you hit me?" or something. And then oh no,
They have
one
to
of the
fight each
the only
other.
the person with the sack is blindfolded, and the other person is not. And the person with the sack has to try and hit the other person with it, and the other person can try to move, but they cannot take their hands off the trunk. I came across it was like probably something from like the SCA or one of those, reenactment groups that they were playing this game. And I was like, that is hilarious.
It
And so
is.
I had to, in my Helgi the Marked books, one of the books, they were playing that. It was winter and they'd just eaten and it was, and so they were playing that. And one of my characters, one of my secondary characters, he was actually blind. And so they were playing with him, but he never lost because he was better.
He had developed all those other senses. He had an edge.
Yeah, yeah, but I was when I found that game and I wish I could remember the name of it. I was like, that is so much fun. How can I not put that somewhere in some book?
Oh, for
So,
sure.
yeah, that's the kind of thing that at least with me, and it sounds like with you too, like you just come across some really interesting thing that they did, whether it's how they brew or what games they played or anything like, and you're like, okay, sometimes you know exactly where to put it, or at least me. And sometimes it's just like, I'll just put that away in my brain
Hmm.
or in some notes somewhere. And when the time is right, I'll just pull that little gem out and use
Yep.
it.
Yeah, in my most recent book, I used, one of the things that you find out when you do some research is that it takes at least 3 years to weave the fabric for a sail.
Mm.
And so in my book, I have a woman try to, she risks her life to try to save a sail because she knows how long it takes and how valuable a sail might be.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, really, a sail is almost as valuable as the ship itself and takes as long or longer to make
Longer,
a sail.
probably.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, whenever I get stuck, I often will just go back to my research and start
Hmm.
reading different things that I've researched in the past, and an idea will eventually come to me of something I can put into my writing that will move it along, but also something that's really interesting. So you talk about some of the things that you've come across in your research, like Constantinople.
Oh,
That was interesting.
that was really, I had to read a lot. And the problem with researching that place is it's changed so much. I mean,
Mm.
not let, Sweden or Norway or Denmark hasn't changed a lot, but Constantinople has changed so much. So
Oh
even though
yes.
I was watching videos, especially something like Hagia Sophia, I had one of my Helgi the Marked in Helgi Tempted was the book where he went there and he goes to Hagia Sophia, and I'm like, okay. So I watched like every video I could get my hands on about it. I read about it. I looked at pictures. I read articles, but it's not the same now as it was in like 900 or whatever. It's changed religions and there's been additions to it. So I just had to kind of just imagine that it was just like all this gold and how beautiful and marble. And so I just played it like he was just in awe. Like, how could humans do this kind of thing? And there's the big dome. And so anyway, that was kind of how I played with something like Hagia Sophia. I kind of played it up like this character, he's very curious and he loves beautiful things. So he's going around the city just like gaping at the different monuments. So I describe him a little bit, but when he asks like his friend, like, oh, like who is that emperor at the top of that, such and such monument? And his friend is like, what are you asking me for? I don't know about these things. And so, so I just kind of leave it up to like the imagine. I describe it, but it's like I researched to see like who that emperor was on his horse on top of some such and such monument, but I decided to just leave Helgi in the dark, and he's just kind of gaping at it like, oh my gosh, this city is amazing, and he just like I imagine like somebody a long time ago might have gone to New York or Paris or something and just walk around like, oh my gosh, look at this place.
Yeah, and there
So.
you're the reader can, experience it through your character's eyes. And
Well, it
I
wouldn't have been realistic either for me to go into a lot of really specific details about these monuments or like what some of the things in the Hippodrome or Hagia Sophia. He wouldn't have known like it was such and such column or
Mhm.
that kind of thing. He's just going like, "Oh my God, look at all that gold."
Yeah. Right.
because he's a Viking. But
Exactly.
yeah, the most fun was the water clock when I wanted to find out, I wanted to learn how they would tell time. Because I knew this was, Constantinople was very sophisticated with people from all over the world. And so I researched water clocks, which was really interesting. So I couldn't resist that. I had him walking through some marketplace or something, and there was a water clock, and he stops to like admire how it's working. And I honestly can't even remember now how that actually did work, but he just took a moment. I couldn't resist that one to go into that one in a little detail.
Yeah, I kind of went off the deep end a little bit in my latest book because I've been so interested in Viking navigation and we
Mm.
know almost nothing about it. So I actually did try in this book to describe their how they navigated. I took something pretty simple, but something we know that they did all the time, which was going from, the west coast of Norway to the Orkney Islands. And how did they do that? And it's fairly simple navigation. So it's star navigation and latitude sailing is what they call it.
Mm.
So I did go into that and describe it a bit. And some people are going to be interested in it, and some people, their eyes are just going to glaze over. But I had fun doing it.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I mean, sometimes you want to like, okay, I really like this.
And it's surprising, some readers are so interested in that
Mm-hmm.
and some are not. And so,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to please everyone, but it was just very fun to do it. And I just had to because I've been longing to for a long time. So
Right, sure. Yeah, I just had to write about the water clock because I was like, that's just cool. I didn't
it
even know
is.
water clocks existed. So I was like, okay. But like it's this book was paced more like a thriller, so I really couldn't
Yeah,
stop.
that's
I mean, that's another thing. Like it depends on the kind of book you're writing. So if you're writing like a crime story or a thriller, if it's historical, you can't stop and all the time and describe something in great detail. It takes away all that tense pacing and stuff. But if you're kind of like taking like several books to write a story, then yeah, take your time, enjoy some of the interesting things.
well, I think that's one of the reasons that I decided to write historical because, I used to read thrillers and mysteries, and I realized I didn't like them.
Oh, I love thrillers and mysteries.
That's so funny. Well, I read them because everybody I knew was reading them, and they'd hand the book, "Here, read this. It's really good." And there's just something missing in them, and it's like I didn't hardly enjoy this. But when I
Mm,
read historical, I really enjoyed it, and I realized eventually it was because I love being transported. Some of
hmm
the thrillers are so taut that you
hmm
don't even really get a feeling of, they say, oh, it's set in this exotic place, but you don't even feel like you've been to that place. I mean, they
mm,
throw in one or two descriptive things, but it's really all, it's all the tense plot and the
hmm
pacing. And I'm not a thrill seeker. So for me,
mm,
it doesn't really, it's not entertaining to me. Those kind of stories are not very satisfying.
hmm hmm
And so that's but when I read these big, sprawling historical fiction novels, I just love them because I feel like I've gone to this place. I feel like I'm really there. So for me, I just want to time travel, and that's what I really love about
mm.
historical fiction.
I like both. I like both. I mean, I read pretty much everything from
Mhm.
literary fiction to fantasy and thrillers and crime and all kinds of stuff and women's fiction.
I
Honestly,
read a lot when I was younger, much more varied, but now as I get older, my preferences are more
mm,
set, which is, what happens when you get older.
well, I think some people just like I know people who only read romance. That's all they
Mhm.
read. They don't
Exactly.
care about anything else. And some people who just read like mysteries and crime dramas. And it's like, that's fine if that's what you like. Lean into that.
Yep.
I just have always I read broadly.
Yeah,
So
I
tell
do.
us about the magic in your books.
Oh, okay. Magic. Well, one of the things that when I first started writing, I did not intend to put any real magic in my books
Mm,
at all. I just wanted straight historical. And the more I researched, the more I realized you can't do that with the Viking Age because they really believed in it. Everybody believed in magic, including the Christians. in Francia and in England and Ireland, they believed that magic was real. And so it was pretty hard to portray that world without making magic real in some way. So I started researching magic, and I realized that if you read the sagas pretty carefully, you'll find that there are rules to their magic. So that's what I tried to stay very close to what they believed and not violate their rules once I figured out kind of what they were.
Mhm.
And we've talked about this at length in some of our other podcasts. But just briefly, we know that shape shifting, it wasn't exactly shape shifting. The person's body didn't turn into another person or creature, but they were able to send their soul or their hugger out and inhabit a familiar, a creature of some kind. And so I really looked into that as being a sort of the mainstay of magic more than anything else. And in this book, I developed the magic even more in that respect. But I do try to stay very close to what they believed. So I use a lot of the different sagas because almost all the sagas and myths have some kind of magic in them. And one of the favorite things is the vulvas. We
Mhm.
have that wonderful description in Eric the Red's saga of one of the last sorceresses,
Mhm.
after they'd already become Christian, but it's described in great detail what she wore and what this as much of the ceremony as possible. And so I used that in my first book for my sorceress Hyde. I based her, she was a different person. She would have been an older sister of this sorceress, and then I learned more about the fact that earlier on, when they were more prevalent and they were very powerful, they had retinues, they had followers. And so I developed an actual following for Hyde, and those characters are starting to play more and more of a part in my
Hmm.
stories. But then we also have the Hagbui, which
Oh wait, before we move on, so in the book this trilogy I'm working on right now, I'm on the first book. It's I'm diving into that kind of magic too. I'm really leaning into that as
hmm,
well. And one of the things and this is something that I don't know if it happens with you very often, but often will happen with me is like something we've talked about on the podcast will like shake a memory loose of something I've learned, in the past. Because I did a lot of research up front. Well, that's been like 10 years ago now.
yeah.
And it's like that, some of that I'm like, wow, okay, maybe I need to go back and revisit some of those, which we're doing with these podcast episodes. And so when we were talking about the Huger and the Hummer and all of that, and I was like, oh, and then it was the bit about when they do that like shape shifting when they're in the body of like whatever animal, they keep their human eyes.
Oh, yes.
And I was like, that is the coolest thing. And I had forgotten about that. So in my book, one of my characters can do that, and she's recognized because somebody sees her eyes and it's like a bad guy sees the eyes and is like, hey. And so he goes after her. But that was one of those just little tiny little tidbits that I had forgotten in my original research. But then when we were doing it for the podcast, and just a little nugget, like, oh, the human eyes, that's got to be something.
And there's even more to it because in I think it's in I'm trying to remember which saga it was in, but they capture one of the sorcerers and they put a bag over his
Oh,
head
yeah, yeah,
and he
yeah.
gets a tear in it so he can see, and that's apparently where his magic, somehow they don't go into detail about it, but his magic is stopped when they put a bag over his head, but once he can see again, he's got access to his magic again.
I think I had the bad guys do that to one of my sorceresses. They covered up her head, or at least her eyes,
Hmm?
because they were afraid of her.
Yeah, so all those go back, and those are, it's like the rules of magic. You have to really read and research to find those rules, but they're there. And they are
Yeah,
consistent through the sagas if you look at it really carefully. But, when the sagas were written, it's like, well, this is something that everybody already knows about,
right.
but not us.
Right. And I remember researching a wedding, a Viking wedding, and there really isn't like a ton because it's like, and then I thought, well, that makes sense. Like if I was writing a book right now that was temporary, contemporary, I wouldn't like go into a lot of detail about like what a typical contemporary wedding is like.
Right.
I would maybe have like the characters at the reception talking or something like that, but I wouldn't be like, okay, and then the bride does this and the groom does that and they wear this and they wear that because everybody reading this just knows. So that gets left out of a lot of those kinds of stories too, these everyday things that everybody listening to the story would have already known, so they just don't talk about it. So that's when you talk about having to like read between the lines and
Yeah, and I have in this latest book, I have two weddings and a funeral. So,
yeah, I've had a couple of funerals as well.
and this is an Irish funeral, so that's even more because when I started researching that, there are so many conflicting things about
Mm,
traditional Irish funerals and going back to the ninth century, it's pretty tough to find. So I really had to kind of cobble things together and
yeah.
try to,
Hmm.
figure out how did these different magic systems work together? Because they
Mm,
had bards, but then they also have keeners, and I learned so many interesting things about keening uh,
mm.
when I was researching it. So I did have to put things together, though.
Yeah, yeah, I've had to do that too. And I was just thinking of something with the magic. Oh, if any of the listeners are interested, check out Neil Price's The Viking Way if you want to learn about Vikings and magic.
Absolutely. That is the best book on. In fact, and I read the first, I was able to actually through interlibrary loans get the first edition of it, which was came out in 2002. And then I had to wait like 3 years to get my hands on the
Mm.
revised edition because it was out of print. And it was actually his doctoral thesis.
Yeah, and it's got lots of great pictures
Oh
and
yeah.
all kinds of stuff. It's like it's a tome. I mean, it's big and it's heavy.
But it's the best, it is the
It's
best
yeah,
book
if
on
you want to
Vikings.
know about, and I'm actually going through it. I'm doing like revisions and I'm like I am not I'm just taking the magic from what I remember and I'm like, okay, I've got to get his book out and I've got to look through it again and what are some of the different ways they went into trances or like all this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I actually sat down and, pretty much wrote down the rules of magic so that I would be consistent in my
Mm,
books. And I'm really glad I did because, to the casual reader, it doesn't seem like there's any rhyme or reason. But when you really sit down
mm,
and look at all the different sources and the burials, I mean, we have some great
mm,
burials that are have now, really been proven that they were magical people. Like for example, the vulva's wand, which is
hmm.
usually metal, it's iron, and it's got like a basket type handle or something on it. And they were called roasting spits by the
Whatever.
early archaeologists. And then eventually it was realized that they were not roasting spits.
Hmm.
But then also the similarities between them and the distaff.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, they're
interesting.
about the same length, aren't they?
And they have the kind of basket type,
Hmm.
they thought it was a handle, but really it's the top. And that's where the wool went that they were weaving. It was used to hold the wool, the
Hmm.
raw wool that hadn't been woven yet. So weaving was women's work and everything to do with it and cloth manufacture. And there was a lot of superstition going on about it at the time. And men were kind of afraid of it in a way. And so I put a lot of that in my books too about how it was considered a magical process and men were not allowed.
Yeah, I like when you said about the rules and the similarities when you really start looking at a lot of the sagas and the burials.
There's so many similarities.
Yeah, even
Modern
like
archaeologists are really starting to do some fantastic interpretations of those
hmm.
burials. Starting with Neil Price. He was probably one of the first people to do that, but there have been several books and papers since then that go even farther. It's really interesting right now.
Hmm.
It's a great time.
Yeah, I've been really enjoying really leaning in. to the magic. And it's funny because I was at a group the other day with with a group of writers here in town. It was in person, and I said something about I was writing historical fiction and now I'm doing historical fantasy. And I was like, except I was like, it's historical fiction because this is what these people really
Right.
believed. They really believed you could do that. I said, but I'm gonna have to like call it historical fantasy because we don't believe this, or at least some of us don't believe that this is actual like history, things that actually happen. So it's going to have to be called fantasy, even though I'm trying really hard and not go outside. I'm trying to not let regular fantasy books influence me too much. Sometimes I'll
Mhm.
find myself going, well, I shouldn't do that because, well, I'm like, well, but no, Vikings did that. So I have to, I'm like, okay, so it's actually historical fiction. We just,
Exactly. I've had other people point that out to me that, because it was their beliefs at the time, it's not really fantasy because fantasy implies that it's not real, but
right.
it was real at their time. But
Hmm.
how do you let the reader know that there is magic? That's the main reason I call it historical fantasy, is so that the reader's prepared for the fact that there's going to be magic in my
Hmm.
books. But you're right, it's so different because we're following historical evidence, whereas, but the other thing to realize is that, most fantasy comes from Viking age beliefs and, whether it was Scandinavian or English or Irish, but it all comes, Tolkien drew almost everything in all the magic in his books from Norse mythology,
Hmm. Yeah.
Norse beliefs. So he was a scholar in that field. So of course the magic originates there, but I really like when it's based on what they really
Hmm.
believed as much as possible.
Yeah, I really like when I've read some like Asian based fantasy recently. One was a Japanese author and one a Japanese American author, and one was like a Chinese American author. And it was really interesting to see how they did the same thing. They took these real myths, these real beliefs that people had. One was about like a young girl who was like a fox demon kind of thing, and I was
Oh
like, it was
yeah.
super interesting. And so I love learning about other cultures, and there's been some African ones as well, and I'm like, this is really cool. I like that it's getting out of the like Northern European, but it's still the same
Hmm.
basic idea that you're taking these stories and these myths and these magical abilities and beliefs from your ancestors, and you're bringing them down to the, like to the modern world, or you're basing it in that time period, but where it's like this is what people believed. It wasn't a myth to them, it was what they actually believed. So that's I really like that.
Yes, bringing it to life. Well, and something that I found really interesting in my research was realizing that some of the things like vampires and The
Mm.
Walking Dead were actually originated, and werewolves,
Yeah.
and they all originated in the Scandinavian beliefs in magic. And they may have been throughout Europe, but for sure they
Hmm.
were in the Scandinavian
Yeah, a lot of those were like Scandinavian, Northern European, Slavic, those countries too.
because the
They all kind of get
Anglo-Saxon,
mixed into, in that, yeah, they all get mixed in together.
and so they're very ancient beliefs. And
Hmm.
they have the Hagbui, the mound
Hmm.
dwellers, which are, the Walking Dead. They truly believed in them, or appeared to, because they gave them these huge monuments. The Oseberg burial ship is is anchored. It's tied to a rock so that these sorceresses or whoever is buried there can't go anywhere. They have to stay where they were buried so that they could continue to bless the land. And Halfdan the Black, his body was supposedly cut into quarters so that all his various kingdoms could have a part of him and bury a part of him so that he would continue to bless the land and bring peace and plenty to the land. So the whole idea of the Hagbui is very interesting. There's a lot in the sagas about them.
Hmm. You mentioned Tolkien. He's got the Barrow Wights, which
Yep,
is
yep.
exactly what they are.
There's quite a few different stories about them, and they definitely have some rules. For one thing, they turn blue or black, dark blue or black, and they're voraciously hungry. So that always made me wonder. There are stories about kings and jarls that had themselves, and even a princess had themselves buried in a mound alive with their companions. And at some point, they broke out of the mound and started storming all over the countryside, eating cattle. And I wondered
Yeah.
if maybe they were still alive and they ran out of food and they were out there.
Well, the number of mounds that are in Scandinavian countries is amazing. So you
Mhm.
know that and there's so many stories in the sagas of some hero or heroine going to an ancestor's burial mound or somebody who they buried, the family buried and now comes back and is just aggravating everybody and killing the servants and like
But also, you would go to an ancestor's burial mound to get guidance. And that was
yeah.
called utaseta, which is sitting out. And a burial mound was the favorite place to sit out. And supposedly, if you sat out on an ancestor's burial mound, you would receive the guidance and the help that you needed. And of course, there's stories of people going to a sorceress's burial mound,
Mhm.
like Odin going to the burial mound of the sorceress outside of the gates of hell to find out about his son's nightmares. But there are quite a few others where they go to their ancestors' graves or their parents' graves.
Mhm. I think
Is
I'm
it?
going to do that in the second book in this trilogy.
Yeah, yeah.
We're going
It's
to
it was a common thing, and it was outlawed in Iceland when they became Christian. In the Grey Goose laws, they said that it was not allowed to sit outside at night and wake up the trolls. Of course, trolls were anything magical. They weren't specific.
Right.
They were supernatural creatures of various kinds.
Well, you must have used that in the Queen in the Mound.
Mhm. Yes, that got me very interested. And I thought, well, what about women buried in mounds? They
Mm,
always refer to men buried in mounds, but they don't always know if it was a man or a woman
mhm.
because there's not always any bones left. And there's a lot of mounds that have never been excavated. So I thought, well, what about if this was a Viking Age queen who was buried and came to life as a Hagbui? So that was very fun. And she's quite a powerful creature. And she's out in the back 40. She's kind of been forgotten about, and she's
Back
not very
40.
happy about that either.
Yeah, they were often unhappy about something, and that's why they came. Usually the undead came back because they were either really unpleasant in life, or they were unhappy about something in their death or their burial. That's
And
funny.
they were very strong-minded characters, very
Hmm.
strong-willed. And so often the strong-willed characters are portrayed as not very nice, and that's probably true.
Yeah, a lot of those men who ended up turning into draugrs they were horrible in
They
life. Oh
were.
my goodness. It's like people were probably like, oh, thank goodness he's gone. And then he comes back as this undead monster.
Yes. And so, our werewolves and our vampires and all of our walking dead, they come from that magical belief. So they've been around for centuries. We don't even
Hmm.
know how long.
And when we're talking about magic, another thing that appears all the time in the sagas are dreams and
Yes.
visions. Like, especially with women, the women often have these really prophetic dreams. So that's another thing I'm using. And I think I did it some in my other books, but I'm really using it with this one, dreams and visions for the women.
Yeah, they really believed that these dreams were prophetic. There's one there's one in I believe it's Halfdan the Black Saga where his wife, Queen Ragnhild, she has dreams all the time, and they're interpreted and they're magical, but he never has a dream. And he goes to a wise man and asks him how to have a dream, and the guy says, well, go sleep in the pig pen and you'll have a dream.
Okay.
I have a feeling this sorcerer didn't like Halfdan very
Yeah,
much,
maybe.
and maybe was kind of, pulling his leg. But he did have a dream.
Okay. Well, I guess it worked.
Yeah. Whether it was the power of suggestion or not, I don't know. Well, talking about research, you mentioned something really interesting about Apaches in Arizona. I want you to tell us about that.
Yeah. So I was in the middle of researching. This was like my original or early research. And I used to do this book bingo every summer. It would go from Memorial Day to Labor Day with a group of friends. And yeah, it had all these different squares. And one of the squares was like read like a nonfiction book about your area or something like that. And so I picked up this book about the Apache, the Chiricahua Apache who live here in southern Arizona. And it was like this really interesting account of a white trader who traded with them and he befriended them and he got to know some of these families and he would like even partook in some of their religious festivals and things. And it was so interesting because he was talking about the Apache and their warriors were formidable. I mean, they were really
They
like the
were.
Vikings. They were
Hmm.
known for how good they were and but when he saw them with their families, he was surprised by how gregarious they were. They were laughing, they would tell jokes, they loved their families. Well, I mean, not, of course, not every single one, just like not every
Right.
single person of any culture does, but like he was, it really struck him like, oh, here are these really vicious warriors, but when they go home, they're like laughing and enjoying their families. So I that was like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting. So I used that to help me create the main male character in my Norse family series, Bjorn, because I was like, okay, he's a vicious warrior when he's fighting, but when I showed him with his young son, he was playful and really loving and he had a good sense of humor most of the time, but when things got a little dire there in the later books, his humor was not quite as good. But yeah, so I was like, oh, that's interesting. This similarity between this Native American culture, this Chiricahua Apache culture, and the Viking culture was like an inspiration for how I created this particular warrior.
And there really are some similarities that are really striking between the cultures.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is, how when the Scandinavians, the Greenlanders, came to America and settled, and then they meet the Scandinavian or the North American Native Americans, their culture, and at first they get along, but then later they don't, and their cultures are so similar in some ways, and yet
Hmm.
not in others.
Yeah. Well, by then, though, the Greenlanders were Christian.
They were, but I mean, it wasn't like they were modern people.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
they still had physically very similar ways of living. So it's very interesting. And I think it would be interesting to see more done on that
Yeah, I've
subject.
always thought that would be a really interesting area to get into, like write a story about that first settlement. But then I go, "Ugh, that's more research." So
It's a lot of research, yeah. And like you said, the culture's changed by then.
yeah.
They're not really Vikings anymore.
Hmm.
Um, they just have they have the Viking background, but not.
Hmm.
So it would be really interesting, but you'd have to do, like you said, a lot of
Yeah.
research.
I was inspired by a lot of non-Viking things. I constantly will be watching something or reading something and or even hear like a song lyric and I'm like, oh, I like that a lot. Like Downton Abbey inspired me and Sons of
I got to hear how
Anarchy.
it inspired you.
Oh,
I find that really quite a quite
Well, I
a,
had these in these two brothers who are feuding are very, very different. And so as I was like coming up with the way like my female character was raised and my male character was raised and I was just like, well, and so I was watching Downton Abbey and I said something to my husband about like, oh, the Earl, he's such a everybody's so kind and they're like kind of open-minded, they're good to their servants. And he said, well, that comes from the top because Robert is like that, the patriarch. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's how I'm going to play this. These two men are very different. And so their families and the people around them are going to be different and they're going to treat people differently because of what comes from this patriarch, this person. And also, like, for my female's character, she has a very strong mother who's a healer. And so, anyway, and they have a really loving relationship, whereas the male character, he doesn't have any of that. He has this horrible. Anyway,
right.
so that was how it was like, it comes from the top. Okay. So, and that was how it inspired. Sounds obvious when I'm talking about it, but at the time I was like, well, how do these two families so different? And anyway,
It's great. It's great
yeah.
that you can get the inspiration from that. Well, and I got inspiration from another time in Scandinavian history, in Norwegian history, a time in the 1800s where there was famine in the land,
Mm.
and they had children called the wandering children.
Oh, wow.
And I have a cousin in Norway who mentioned them to me, and I had never heard of them. There's actually a trail that you can take in Norway that will take you all the way across. So these were children that were growing up on the farms in the central southern Norway, where the land really was not very rich. They couldn't feed all their children. So they would send them off. These children as young as 7, most of them were, probably 11, 12, 13, but they would walk for an entire week to get to the coastal areas like Vestfold, where the farms were rich, and they would work on these farms all summer long
Mm.
and of course they'd feed them and house them, and then they would come back in the winter with their earnings for their families. But this went on for like 100 years in
Wow. I
Scandinavia.
had never
Yeah, it
heard of
was
that.
I hadn't either,
Hmm.
but there's actually a trail commemorating them because it was
Huh.
the way they all walked along this way. And so I just had these thoughts of all these children of
Mm.
various ages walking to these farms. And that would make such an interesting story to write about. But I did incorporate that a little bit into my second book, where Queen Osa she comes back and takes over her father's kingdom, but she doesn't have any warriors. And
Mm.
so she's recruiting big time. And these 5 sisters come from the farm. And they can't feed them all. And I'm sure it happened more than once
Sure.
in Scandinavian history, especially in Norway, where there isn't a lot of arable land. And so these sisters left their home and came to offer themselves to Osa in whatever capacity she would take them on.
Hmm.
And so she was glad to have them. And they eventually become shield maidens. But, it's based on the tale of the wandering children, which is a true tale. And that's when the immigration from Norway to the United States began. And Stavanger, which would be the nearest port for these people, that's one of the main immigration places for many of us whose ancestors or whose grandparents or great grandparents came to this country during that time. So
Hmm.
at one time, Norway was the poorest European country.
Oh, wow. I haven't even been, I don't know, it just popped into my head. Another research that I do that gets into my books is my Aikido practice.
Oh, yes, I
I
bet.
use that a lot when I do fight scenes, especially with swords or anything, or like a spear, which we work with staffs, but they don't have
Mhm.
points on the end, but they're a long staff, and so I use that experience whenever I write a battle scene, and I'll be like, okay, wait, what would he do? He would do this or that, or is this believable? Or yeah, so I do that a lot. Sometimes I'll even act it out.
Oh, that's
Like,
cool.
yeah, I had my Helgi the Mark character. He lost his sword And so he has to dive for it. And then as the guy's coming, he holds the sword up. And so I was on the ground and had my husband come running up to me. And I wanted to see how quickly I could get my sword. It's a wooden sword, get my sword up to, stop him. I just wanted to make sure it was believable. So yeah, I
Yeah,
use that a lot.
I don't think you can write fight scenes without some, background in it. Studied martial arts when I was younger, and I also did Tai Chi for quite a few years, and
Mm,
there's a sword form in Tai Chi
hmm
that I studied. So it really makes a big difference. And then also, I was a sailor for 20 years.
mm.
And, the navigation, the ship handling. I lived on a sailboat for 13 years.
Oh,
So, and,
wow.
sailed a lot. And even a modern sailboat is not that different than a Viking ship. It is, but there's a lot of the same principles. So you can really feel that, what it was like. You can put
Mm,
yourself in that situation.
hmm
Like you said, it's really important to be able to do that.
Yeah. That adage to write what you know, it's not necessarily right about whatever I do. It's like, okay, so I know a little bit about this but I think they're also talking about like human emotions, right? Write about what you know. So I,
Mhm.
yeah, I like to write about families and relationships and found families and friends and all that kind of stuff. That's human emotions are what we all know. I mean, we don't all have the same, and we're not all like, attracted to the same kinds of people or whatever, but most of us can relate to.
Yeah,
We've
in
all
fact,
had parents in some form, and whether they're in our lives or not, we all have them, and so we all have some friends, and
I'm thinking about an injury one of my characters has. And years ago, I was in a car accident and I had a terrible head injury and it caused swelling in the brain for months.
scary.
It was very painful and very scary because it did affect my memory.
Hmm
And I was afraid that I might not get it back because sometimes when parts of your brain are damaged, it doesn't come back.
hmm
But towards and there was really nothing that would help the pain when it came on. It was like a migraine and you just had to survive it. And then it
Mm.
would eventually go away. You could use ice on your top of your head and that would help some, but it was very painful and it was an awful experience. And then one day after I'd been going through this for 2 or 3 months, we went to the ocean and I got out of the car and I was listening to the sound of the waves. And
Mm.
it was just like I craved that feeling, that sound. And I just sat there for, I don't know, an hour listening to it. Afterwards, I felt much better. And
Oh my gosh,
it,
that's
it, it did
lovely.
go away, shortly after that. So I always attribute that sound of the waves as being a healing thing. Um,
Hmm
it was the feeling was really something. I mean, almost everyone likes the sound of the waves is soothing and everything, but I was craving it. It was like
Mm.
it was really quite an experience. So I
Mm.
did put that in my books.
That's neat. I love that. Yeah, I've used the injuries I've had in the past in my book. Like I've had 3 concussions, nothing that severe, but enough to know like what it
How
feels
it
like
feels.
to have a
Yeah.
concussion, like the nausea and the horrible
Mhm.
headache and just the sensitivity to lights. And so I've used that experience, like I've had tons of sprains and a bone bruise and a stress fracture and just
A life well lived.
yeah, so when my Vikings get hurt, I'm like, yeah, this is what it feels
You can
like.
sympathize.
Yeah, one of my pet peeves is when writers or books, TV shows, movies give somebody a concussion and then they're okay.
Yeah,
Like,
5 minutes later.
yeah, or even like a few hours later, I'm like, no, no, no,
Not
no.
with it, not if you get knocked out.
Right,
Not if
right.
it's a real concussion. It has long-lasting effects.
Yeah, and it's just like, no, you don't just get up and yeah, I remember somebody had that character who got like punched in the nose like really hard, like enough to like cause black eye and stuff. And they like just like went out to dinner or something that night. And they weren't even acting like they were even in pain. And I'm like, do you know how much it hurts to get punched in the nose? Your nose is going to be throbbing. You're going to have a headache.
And you're going to look really weird.
So I was like, I don't think she's doing
No,
that.
no. I mean, it's hard to breathe when your nose has been affected. I mean, you have
I
to
mean,
breathe through your
even just
mouth, and
hit hard in the nose just hurts.
it does.
Yeah.
And if it's hard enough, it can kill you.
Yeah. Especially if it's in a particular way.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess, we do a lot of research. That's not really research. That's just life experiences that
Exactly.
inform our fiction.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes you have to just write the story and then say, how can I make that work?
Hmm.
And that can be interesting too, because then you go back and do the research and say, okay, well, what can I use? How can this work?
Hmm.
Sometimes it's something you already know about, you want to fit it into your story, but other times it's that you've got the storyline and you have to make it work by incorporating things that are real. Like what kind
Hmm.
of injury could this person have had that would still allow them to do what they have to do in the next scene?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
That can be hard.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's hard to, as I've learned in my writing, it's hard to keep track of injuries. It's hard to keep
Hmm.
track of children, and it's hard to keep track of pregnancy. Because
Mm.
whenever I've done that, I think about the like my trilogy. I was like, okay, how old is this little kid now? Okay, he's this
Yeah,
old. So what is he doing? How is he talking? Like I had a character who was pregnant, and I'm like, where is she? I'd be writing, and I'd be like, wait, wait, wait. How far along is she in her pregnancy? Like, oh, jeez.
at the beginning of every book, I have to sit down and my books have character lists and it includes their ages. And so I sit down at the end of every book and at the beginning of every book and I update that character list, add characters to it, but I also put in their ages because that is so important. And way back early on, I really had to do a timeline and I
Mm.
really had to really figure out when was this person born. And so I don't do it on a computer. I keep a 3-ring binder that's a story Bible, and I keep all those things in there because it's really important, especially when you're doing a long-running series. So book 7, it's hard to keep track.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to do that with especially like the kids. I don't really focus since my characters aren't historical people. I just try to mention maybe briefly how old they are, but I just hadn't, when we're not these people weren't like calendar based like we are. Like they
Right.
would have a general idea
They
like
were
so and so
seasonal.
was born around the equinox or something or they're not going to know like today is my birthday.
That's right.
So they're going to have a vague idea too of like a general idea of like how many winters or summers or however they want to count it they have been alive. So it's not going to be like a totally precise exact dating. Like I think I even mentioned that in my most recent book like oh yeah so and so's almost 9 because he was born near the equinox.
Yeah, I try to remember at least the children's birthdays, what month they were born in and year. And then there's also, they didn't have the same sense of time of day,
Hmm.
especially up in Scandinavia where you have such drastic differences between summer and winter as far as the daylight. And I haven't done a lot of research into imagining that, but I do like when they're sailing, like with the navigation, for example, in this latest book, I had to make sure it was a time of the summer where they
Hmm.
could actually see the stars because
Hmm.
and they have different types of twilight, which I didn't know before I started researching this, but they have civil twilight and nautical twilight.
Hmm.
And so they're all different stages of darkness, where some of them you can see the stars and some of them you can't.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
yeah, it's very interesting. So, fortunately, this was taking place in August, this book. So, they could actually see the stars. But if it was in July, even, they would not see the stars at night up in the,
Mm,
even
it was
in,
too light.
mhm.
Hmm.
And, the further north you get, of course, the less you can see these stars.
That's interesting. So I've spent all of my life in the South,
Hmm.
Arizona, Southern California. Texas for a little while, and so I'm not used to darkness like that. But have a friend who lived for a time as a child in Alaska. And so
Hmm.
she's talked about like how hard it was in the summer to go to sleep and they had to have blackout curtains and nobody's tired. So I did that a little bit like with my in this latest book with my character. She has to raise her younger half brother and sister and her little sister's like, it's still light outside. I don't want to go to sleep. And it's like, you have to go to sleep.
I had some relatives in Seward, and when I used to sail to Alaska, I would visit them, and they did not sleep in the summer. They really didn't. I mean, very little. They slept very little. They would be out all night, and they'd say, "Well, we'll sleep in the winter." And obviously, they slept some, but
Yeah.
it was minimal, and they just didn't even resist it. It was part of their. I mean, they were hunters and fishermen, and
Mm.
it was just part of their lifestyle.
Yeah, when I visited Sweden, when we were in Stockholm in particular, it was the very end. It was right around the summer solstice. So we were there the end of June, beginning of July. And yeah, I remember just being out. It was like 10, 11 o'clock at night, like just still walking around.
Hmm.
And I remember thinking, this is fun. I
Yeah.
like just
When
being
you're
able.
young, it's great.
Well, I wasn't that young. It wasn't that long ago. But yes, even still, I was like, this is cool.
Well, I was on a ship, and so our staterooms were below decks, so we didn't have portholes, and we couldn't see the light. So it was like a blackout hull. It
Ugh,
wasn't
that
hard
sounds.
to sleep for us, but when I'd stay with my cousins, we'd be up, we'd go fishing, we'd fish
Mm.
until 10 at night, and meals were just whenever. They just didn't follow any kind of regimented lifestyle like that.
I guess living in these southern places, I just crave natural light. Like the
Mm.
library where I work, we have a lot of windows and stuff. Even the room where we tutor, we have there's glass and it looks out. And I just don't know if I could work in a place that was just all inside, indoors, like no windows and stuff. I think I would.
That was just our staterooms. We didn't actually, our I was a I was a purser, and so my office was up above decks.
Oh, that's
And
nice.
when we were outside a lot. So
Oh, it's sure, sure.
it was
Yeah.
just at night that you'd go down to your stateroom and it would be really dark. But
Well,
you
that would
didn't
be
mind
okay
that
then.
because
Yeah, you do need the dark to sleep.
but when you go to sea, you're outside, you're on deck a lot, unless you're an engineer. And then they work in the basement. That's what my
Yeah.
husband did. But I grew up in Minnesota, and so we had a lot of snow there. And we did spend a ton of time outside. So when I do write about winter in my books, they're outside a lot.
Hmm.
They don't huddle around the fire. There is no way. I mean, Vikings would never do that. And Scandinavians don't do that. They're outside. They ski, they sled,
Hmm.
they ice skate, they go hunting on skis, so and even when it was dark, they didn't care. They went out.
Hmm. I remember reading something about Viking Age Sweden that they actually traveled more in the winter because the lakes and everything were
Frozen.
iced over, so they didn't have to go around all these. There's a lot of lakes in Sweden, so they didn't have to go around all these bodies of water that they were now iced over, and it was easier to travel.
Yeah. And
So,
when you look at the Oseberg burial ship, there were four sleighs or
mm,
sledges on there. There were some of them, three of them were very ornate, fancy, but they were definitely functional. And then
mhm,
one was like a working sledge. And the skis date back thousands of years in
mhm,
Scandinavia. They don't even know how long ago. It's back to Neolithic times or earlier. So that they got around in
mhm.
snowshoes and then
Ice skates.
skates
Mm.
out of cow bones.
Yeah.
That was found in Dublin. No, not Dublin. York.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Jorvik. That's where I
Jorvik.
think they discovered the skates. But yeah, they were only indoors to sleep really, because those even the big halls were not the most pleasant places. Although
Right.
I
That's true.
did when I was on a cruise, I did stop at Borg and we went to a Viking feast in a replica hall, and
Fun.
it was really very nice because they had a fire going,
Hmm.
but because the wood was well seasoned and dry, there was no smoke inside there at all. The smoke went up through the smoke holes, and it
Hmm.
was actually very pleasant there because I was a little worried. I have asthma, and I was a little worried about whether it would affect me, but it didn't affect me even in the slightest. So,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, yeah. So I don't think they were as smoky as people would think. I'm sure they knew how to season wood properly,
Mm-hmm.
and so I suspect the long fires weren't that bad.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't have used wet wood.
Ugh, no. Yeah. And that's another thing that I like to portray too is people dyed their clothes and people
Mm.
painted their stuff, or they were all these carvings and all this artwork that we see that was put on something. So, yeah, it wasn't like they were just living these horrible menial lives where, I mean, obviously there was a lot of hard work, but there was a lot of beauty in it as well.
Yes, there was, and they did. The ships were painted. The sledges were. They found traces of paint on the sledges, and so they were very beautiful. And the clothing, they were dyed. Now, a
Mhm.
lot of what we have is kind of brown because the dyes have faded and kind of moldered. But during the time that they were, in use, they were quite brilliant and beautiful.
Mhm.
And they treasured them. They really did.
Mhm. Well, that was fun.
Yeah. Without
We
being
could
too
keep going
graphic,
all day long, I
I
think.
think so. It would be easy to do.
We might need to wrap it up.
Yep.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's fun to talk about research and how it informs writing. It's kind of neat. I mean, I guess that's what makes us historical writers, is because we
It's
like.
such a big part of our lives. I
Hmm.
mean, most of the reading I do is not fiction. It's mostly, nonfiction about the Viking Age. So I do a ton of that kind of reading.
Yeah. Well, great.
Yeah.
That was
Nice to
fun.
see you.
You too. All right. And we will see you next time. Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, KS, at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.